Hello everyone. So in this video, I'll discuss briefly, though hopefully in depth, the concept of Apeiron that we talked about in the last couple of videos in Anaximander. So let me first start by reading out a couple of sort of testimonia or rather explanations from Aristotle, where he talks about Anaximander's Apeiron, though in one of them he doesn't name Anaximander personally, but we know whom he's talking about. So first one. There is no one of these things, fire, air, water, earth, from which come all things, and certainly nothing else beside these, such as something halfway between air and water, or air and fire, being thicker than air and fire, and finer than the others, for that will be air and fire simply, together with contrariety. But one of the two opposites is a privation, so that it is impossible for the intermediate ever to exist in isolation, as some say the infinite and the surrounding does. So what is Aristotle doing there? He's criticizing Anaximander indirectly by saying, I'm not sure that this weird intermediate thing between elements can exist, right? But what we can glean from that, and you can see how we do ancient philosophy often enough, what we can glean from that is that there was an idea of this substance, which was somewhere intermediate, if you want to call it, though that could possibly pretty much be Aristotle's interpretation of the Apeiron, right? So which means that there's some intermediate substance between the hot, the cold, the wet, the dry. And Aristotle is like, that cannot exist. That sounds pretty weird, right? But we can start thinking of this, this substance that, if it is a substance at all, but most probably is a substance because we're thinking of these Anaximander as a natural philosopher, which is an intermediate, let's say, substance between all of them. That's like, just hold that thought. That's one of the interpretations of Apeiron, right? Let's read on from Aristotle. This is from Aristotle's Physics, where he says, two types of explanation are given by the physicists. Those who have made the subsisting body one, either one of the three or something else which is thicker than fire and finer than air, generate the rest by condensation and rarefaction, that's Anaximenes more like, making it into many. But the others, and this is Anaximander, say that the opposites are separated out from the one, being present in it, as Anaximander says, and all who say there are one and many, like Empedocles and Anaxagoras, you'll do them later, for these two separate out the rest from the mixture, right? So he's talking about two kinds of processes of change. One is sort of changing of matter into other, transformation through condensation and rarefaction, so processes, and that's not Anaximander. And the other, which is Anaximander, is the question of sort of separating out and conflict of opposites, right? So, creating of gap and separating out and breaking apart of different elements. So there are two ideas of change that Aristotle is putting together out here. So I'll read on. But yet, nor can the infinite body be one and simple, whether it be, as some say, that which is beside the elements, from which they generate the elements, or whether it be expressed simply. For there are some people who make what is beside the elements, the infinite, and not air and water, so that the rest be not destroyed by the infinite substance, for the elements are opposed to each other. For example, air is cold, water moist, and fire hot. And if one of those were infinite, the rest would already have been destroyed. But as it is, they say that the infinite is different from these, and that they come into being from it, right? So we already talked about this. So the idea that no one of them could be infinite, right? That should be something which is infinite, which is one and simple, a single, and that's why Anaximander is also considered a monist, even though he talks about hot, the cold, the wet, the dry, but there is only a single Apeiron, right? So there is a single substance, and that's why he's also a monist and not a pluralist. And that one single Apeiron then sort of through separating out becomes different elements, and this sort of notion of separating out is what you see in what you see in the world around you, what you see in the lakes and the rivers and the fires and the trees and the wood and the earth, and none of them are taking over. So we already talked about it enough. Then belief in infinity would result, for those who consider the matter, for the most part, from 5 factors. Further, because only so would generation and destruction not fail if there were an infinite source from which that which is coming to be is derived, right? So these are the descriptions we have of Apeiron, or the infinite, from Aristotle. And I'll just read out a couple more before we start doing this analysis. So one more from physics. Nor in order that generation may not fail, is it necessary for perceptible body to be actually infinite, for it is possible for the destruction of one thing to be the generation of other, the sum of things being limited. So here he's criticizing, the idea of actual infinity that we have in Anaximander, where he says that the matter is actually infinite. This Apeiron is actually infinite. What Aristotle says that it could actually be finite and then keep going around in circles, like the idea of infinity, for example, of a ring, right? Where if you start here and you go round, then it's a finitely infinite sort of thing, or a Mobius strip, or any such kind of a thing where you can go around in circles, and it will give you a notion of infinity. You bound it in a nutshell and think yourself, king of the infinite world, as Hamlet says. Even within limit, you could think of it as infinity. But with Anaximander, that's not what we have. With Anaximander, we have what is an actual infinity, right? Because what he says is that there is an infinite Apeiron from which all these things separate out, and then they dissolve into that as well. Birth and destruction is within that. Then, of the infinite, there is no beginning. But this seems to be the beginning of the other things, and to enfold all things and steer all, as all those who say, who do not postulate other causes, such as mind or love, which we'll look at later, above and beyond the infinite. And this is the divine, for it is immortal and indestructible, as Anaximander says, and most of the physical speculators. Right, so here again what we have is that, you have what he says, of the infinite there is no beginning, as we already discussed, because it has no boundaries. So a beginning would be a boundary, right? A limit, something that makes it finite. So there's no beginning. And it itself is the beginning of all things. It enfolds everything, it guides everything, right? And if it has no beginning, it has no end, it doesn't die, right? That means that it makes it immortal, athanatos, indestructible, right? There is a constant balance redressal going on inside, but the sum total doesn't change, right? There is always the same sum total. There might be one thing might take over, fire, or the hot might take over the cold or the wet or the dry or whatever, but there's no destruction. So this thing then becomes immortal, and as we already discussed, what is immortal was considered to be divine. That is the definition of divine that we had in the ancient world. What differentiates the divine from human is basically that humans are mortal, right? And thanatos, and the divine are immortal, athanatos, right? Right. So yeah, I don't think there is much more to read. I'll share this chapter with you, which you can read by yourselves. And let's sort of, let's analyze, as I promised. I know I spent like 5 minutes doing something I had promised not to, but it's good to look at the original, sort of testimonia that we're looking at as well. So what is this Apeiron that we're talking about? What could it possibly be? Now, having looked at Aristotle's critique and Aristotle's sort of testimony, the one way of understanding Apeiron, and as I said, without boundaries, could be understanding it as what he just said, immortal, deathless, imperishable, eternal, ageless, right? And if you think of it as immortal, deathless, imperishable, eternal, ageless, what we're doing is we're thinking of it temporally, right? We're thinking of it in terms of time, which means that what we're saying is that, this Apeiron as arche is both the original state of things, it's a beginning of things, it's a generation of things, and it has existed for all time. It's thinking temporarily, as I said, it's existed for all time, and it is a permanent ground of the being of all things, right? It's a permanent ground of all things, and it is then the end of things. That's where things would end, right? So that's a temporal understanding. That's where things begin. That's what things are right now, and that's what things will be. The idea of the everlasting as what was, what is, what will be, right? And that's why this arche cannot have an arche. Yeah, this is the arche, and there is no arche of the arche. There's no infinite regress. Why? Because it was, it is, it will be. It is sort of, temporally infinite. Apeiron without boundaries in a temporal sense. Then, can we also think of it in spatial terms? Well, yes. Why? Because remember, we have all these 4 elements and they are inexhaustible, right? I mean, one takes over the other, but then the other one is encroaching somewhere else. So there is an idea of this inexhaustible infinity that we have here. And, the 4 elements themselves are inexhaustible then, because they come from this apeiron, which is inexhaustible. So the 4 sort of, opposites, let's say, I keep saying elements, but the 4 opposites are also inexhaustible. And that doesn't mean that, they need to constantly keep drawing from this apeiron, like this apeiron is this well from which, the 4 elements are drawing one after the other. Rather, you can think of it in terms of, the spatial infinity, in terms of it doesn't run out, right? In thought, it doesn't run out. Then we could go back to what Aristotle was saying, which was that we could be dealing with a circular concept, It doesn't need to be an actual infinity. It could actually just be a sort of circular infinity, that it doesn't run out in thought, in that sense. But yeah, we can take a call on this, whether we want to think of it as an actual infinity or we want to think of it as, a circular infinity. And you have this interchangeability of elements in this infinite then. One element turns into another, another turns into the first. And the lack of boundaries between elements, the boundaries which are the peras, right? The lack of boundaries, so that, they fuse into one another when, like they are in the apeiron state, and then separate out as themselves. So that's another idea of infinity, and we could call it less infinity and more sort of an indefiniteness or indeterminacy. Right, it is indeterminate. The boundaries, it could be internal boundaries, right? So we have talked about, external boundaries spatially, that, it doesn't run out, we don't know on what end, spatially infinite. Temporally infinite, there's no beginning, there's no end, which is more circular, but yeah, there's temporally infinite, spatially infinite, but also internally infinite, right? No internal boundaries, which means that they fuse into one. And that fusion, then you have the chaos that appears in Hesiodic terms, or in this case, there's a separating out through whatever action, probably because they're in constant motion, and that motion inside causes, and you will see later when we come to the atomists, that they actually then start giving a more of an account. In fact, before that, Empedocles and Anaxagoras also give an account of this motion, and why does it separate out in this way. But right now, as you saw, we only have these 2 little fragments. So there is a separating out, which means that they were fused together and then they sort of scattered. Yeah. So we can think of it, as I said, as a temporal infinity. We can think of it as a spatial infinity, and we can just think of it in very conceptual terms as basically something that is the arche, right? Like in the sense that if you think of infinity, of the apeiron or the infinite, as having no origin, in a very conceptual term, it does not have an origin, it does not begin. And beginning would be a limit. So that means that it's more conceptual, there is no limit. And it originates everything else, right? So it is unlimited. It actually gets very close to the temporal one that we were talking about, but you can put all of these in a very conceptual term as a kind of conceptual infinity of something that underlies everything, doesn't begin, doesn't end, is everything in the world is what it is. It's like it is apeiron. It's, as I said, it's very sort of abstract and philosophical out here, rather than an immediate thing that you can touch and experiment on. So in that sense, as Aristotle points out, it's divine, right? Because it is ungenerated, not born, right? There is no birth to it. It is something that nourishes all things, if you want to think of it in terms of nourishment. It is generative, it is a begetter of all, right? As Okeanos was in one of the fragments we read. And it is immortal, right? It doesn't die. So that pretty much qualifies it as being divine, and also a more active divine than just only immortal, right? It's immortal plus it is generative and ungenerated and all kinds of things, right? So that means that it is there is a divinity to the Apeiron, and it's also one. It's single, right? And as we already said, there is a monist element to the Apeiron, to the first philosophers we are talking about. So, like with Thales, we had water as being, the one and only arche. With Anaximander too, we have, the Apeiron as being one and only arche. Even though it sounds like it's more than one, it's not. It's a single Apeiron. Yeah. All right then. Thank you.